Hi, everybody. Good day. Welcome to the panel 2, Geo-strategic and Geo-economic Dynamics of National Security, Innovation, and Economics in the Era of Great Power Rivalry and Technological Revolution, Part 1. Such a long title, but anyway, welcome to this panel. My name is Endo, Professor of International Relations at Hokkaido University. I first, before starting this session, I would like to congratulate the Giulio Pugliese and Min Cheung for organizing this very timely conference, focusing on this sort of conjuncture between the, where the, strategic and techno-economic dynamics meet each other, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. I myself find this topic quite critical because the finance technology and especially the information infrastructure networks are the sort of foundations apart from the military forces for the establishing the global hegemony, as was the case with the 19th century empire, the British Empire, with the city's banks, Lloyd's, Reuters, and 20th century's empire, United States, with Wall Street banks, New York Times, CNN, and the internet, and so on. So the whether this sort of critical networks and the infrastructure are formed in open or closed manner, is quite important. It's quite influential. To see what sort of 21st century world order is forthcoming. Now, this and next sessions explore this frontier of geostrategic and geo-economic nexus, with this one focusing on the US-China and next on the Euro-Japan. Now, we have for this 4 excellent speakers. First, the Professor Min Cheung, the organizer of this conference, the PhD from King's College, currently the director of the Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation at US Santiago, and the long-time analyst of the Chinese and Eastern Asian security and defense policies, and the author of Fortifying China, as well as the Forging China Military Might. And second speaker is Professor William Norris, professor at the Texas A&M University, the expert of Chinese foreign and security policy at the that university's George Bush School of Public Policy. He's got the PhD at MIT, focusing on the confluence of economic and security in China, and the recently analyzing also the US-China military conflicts, with the possibility of the escalation from conventional to nuclear wars. And the third and fourth speaker is the Professor Vinod Aggarwal, and Dr. Andrew Reddie, both at the UC Berkeley. The Professor Aggarwal is a director of the Berkeley's APEC Center, an expert of politics of trade and finance. And Dr. Reddie is specialized in security and emerging technologies and arms control. We also have as a discussant the Dr. Kristi Govella, the senior fellow and the deputy director of Asia program at German Marshall Fund of the United States. She is an expert of the sort of intersection between economics and security in Asia, and Japan's foreign and security policy. So we have a bunch of well-known, wonderfully able experts to discuss the conjuncture between the geo-strategic and geo-economics. So each speaker has 10 minutes with the discussant 15 minutes. So Professor Cheung, could you kick off the debate, please?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Endo, and it's a pleasure to be able to participate in this. And also, this is the first time that the UCC system and my institute, the Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation, that we're collaborating with EUI itself, and we hope this will continue on. Can I share my screen? It doesn't seem to be working right now. So I can have my presentation. Unfortunately, let's see. Nope, it's been disabled, unfortunately. So can the tech allow screen sharing?
Just give us 1 second.
Okay.
Oh.
Hopefully, Professor Endo, you're not counting my time on this.
We should, the rest of us should say thank you to Ty for going first and being the first guinea pig through the technical hurdles.
Right, yes. So hopefully you'll come on soon. If not, then I'll have to sort of like talk through. My presentation is going to be about sort of like at the systems level. It's looking at the nature of sort of the technological and security competition between the US and Japan. Now we have the screen sharing. Okay. So what I'm looking at is the nature of this competition, this great power competition in the what I call the techno-security domain, in which sort of like where sort of like technology and innovation and national security and military issues, they sort of like meet and they engage in a lot of competition. I mean, the escalating sort of US-China frictions, and especially the efforts by the US and increasingly by China as well, to try to decouple or to try to sort of find ways to to deleverage their engagements in the economic and technological sort of realms, has become front and center of this great power competition between the US and China. And what I wanted to do is sort of provide a little bit of historical context. I mean, the standoff that we see between China and the US is not the first time that these two countries have faced this type of situation. We can sort of compare it to the US-Soviet Cold War that took place in the 1940s to the 1980s itself, and there's a lot of sort of debates about sort of like how does sort of like the late 20th century Cold War compare to sort of the US-China sort of like great power competition to today. While there are similarities, there's also important differences that I want to sort of point out. And the current US-China rivalry, I would say, when we look and compare with the Soviet-US rivalry, it's significantly more complicated and a lot more comprehensive. And one reason is that between the Soviet Union and the US in the late 20th century, that was primarily on the geostrategic and on the military side of competition. Between the US and China today, there's much more of a geo-economic competition linked in with the geo-strategic, which is comparable to the US-Japan rivalry itself of the 80s and 90s. So what we might want to do is to sort of like look at both the Japanese and the Soviet geo-strategic and geo-economic rivalries, and look at how that sort of like compares with the China sort of rivalry. And another reason why it's more complicated is that sort of in the late 20th century, there was a very clear compartmentalization between the commercial and the military spheres of competition. In the 21st century, that has become increasingly blurred. There's increasingly what we call dual-use civil military, sort of like integration, and the rise of new sort of emerging and strategic technological areas too. So one way is to look at this is like when we look at this great power competition back in the late 20th century, there was the Soviet Union on one side and Japan on the other side. The Soviet Union, as I mentioned, the competition that the US faced was in the defense sphere, in the geostrategic, and the ideological spheres, while Japan was primarily on the commercial sphere. And there was very, very little sort of like spillovers between these two countries. There was very little in sort of dual use military civil domain. So the US was competing against the Soviet Union and Japan in these different dimensions. The main reason why the US sort of competed against sort of the Soviet Union and Japan at the same time, but the US did it sort of like far more sort of like effectively and efficiently, and in the end it won out sort of like both against the Soviet Union, against Japan, was that the US had a very different development model. The US model, as opposed to the more sort of like one-dimensional models that the Soviet Union and Japan had, the US had a very integrated military, techno-nationalist base, as well as a commercial techno-globalist system, so that within the US sort of economy, the US research and development systems, they sort of like their systems, sort of like in research and development, were very much engaged in both commercial and strategic. And having this integrated military and civilian technological and economic system provided a lot of strong benefits and strong synergies, especially whether it's strong corporations, sort of very powerful and engaged in innovation systems that sort of allow for long-term competition. This allowed the US, because of these structural domestic advantages, which are sort of like Will and Vinny and Andrew will talk about, provided sort of like significant comparative strategies and allowed the US to target a lot of the critical weaknesses of the Soviet and Japanese systems. So that was in the late 20th century. Today, what the US faces in terms of the great power competition with China is that the Chinese system is much more similar to the US system and very different from the compartmentalized Soviet and Japanese systems. The Chinese system, which I call a techno-security state, is very much of an integrated sort of like techno-security system, where the commercial and the defense are very much overlaps in this dual-use military civil sphere. So what we can sort of assess is that China is a combined Soviet-Japanese challenge because of this integrated military commercial techno-nationalist state. And the integration between the military and the commercial components is more than just the sum of these sort of the commercial military parts itself. The intertwining, the dual use aspects adds up to a much more powerful ecosystem. Let's see, sorry. And I mean, I don't have time here, but it's like key elements of the Chinese techno-security system are things like military civil fusion and increasingly securitized economic base. The Chinese sort of economy is increasingly focused on innovation-driven development strategy, and there's sort of also there's a very sort of like sort of effective mobilization model for strategic technology development. So let's see. So what I want to do at the very end of the presentation is to compare the US and Chinese techno-security systems itself. And this is sort of like critical to be able to assess and understand what this long-term competition between the US and China is going to look like, because the next 10, 20, even longer years, the central focus, the center of gravity of the great power competition is between the China and the United States in this techno-security space. And what we essentially see is that China has a very sort of like, while they are both sort of these integrated techno-security states, the Chinese model and the US model are significantly different. China is what I would define is very much of a statist approach to techno-security development. And the statist model is a very much of a top-down, state-led approach. And so there's a lot of coordination at the center, and sort of like, and there's a lot of authoritarian control. The US has a much more sort of anti-statist, more of a bottom up sort of like market-driven model itself. So while on the outside they may seem the same, the structure and the dynamics that drives these two sort of states are in many ways sort of like fundamentally different. Although it's like, I mean, this status model that the Chinese have is an ideal type. It's not as clear cut. There's still some bottom up, and likewise on the US side. But at the end of the day, these two represent very different models. And I don't have time to go into that, but there's like there's 5 different factors that I sort of like put forward in my analysis, like the nature of the threat perceptions, the leadership and management coordination, the nature of the governance regime, where the Chinese is much more sort of like about reliance on sort of like on penalties and administrative controls to ensure efficiency and compliance, while the US is much more of an incentives-based, a rewards-based model of development. There's the nature of hybridization. People mention how sort of like for China, a key part of its sort of techno-security state is military civil fusion, while for the US, it's sort of like the hybrid model is much more sort of a very, very effective model of public-private coordination and cooperation. And then there's also the notion of techno-nationalism between these two states, while the Chinese have a sort of a much more dependent model of techno-nationalism, while it's depended a lot on foreign technology know-how to enable its development. The US have been much more in terms of exporting its techno-nationalist sort of capabilities through exports and collaboration. And the overall assessment is that in the early 2020s to today in 2022, for example, China has a much more motivated and politically committed sort of build up in its techno-security system. It's sort of like its leadership and management is much more mobilized and coordinated, but the US is still ahead. The US is now sort of like has identified China as its primary threat. So now the US is beginning to mobilize, although it's taken a lot longer itself. But it's like the sort of what we're seeing is the gap between China and the US is closing, and sort of the next 15 to 20 years, it will very much depend on the nature of the status and anti-status models of development. And sort of like, and lastly, and also because of what we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine, so the last sort of like sort of diagrams like, so you have the Chinese techno-security state itself. And what we also will likely see is increasingly sort of like in terms of if we see a new Cold War, the Russian techno-security state will also become a major factor, and especially the Sino-Russian sort of techno-security cooperation, which right now is we're still waiting in which direction that will go. To me, it seems pretty clear that Russia and China will increasingly cooperate on their military security development. And so this adds another layer of sort of strength for the Chinese and the Russians in competing against the US. And I'll end it there.
Professor Ming Cheung, thank you very much indeed for your sort of clarifying the nature of the great power competitions in the 21st century. You know, with China as a sort of techno-security state, with the change, under Mr. Xi Jinping's leadership. And I'm particularly impressed by your addition, comeback of Russia, and combine this sort of entire picture with this the tragedy in Ukraine, and Russian challenge is added on to the US-China rivalry. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Professor Norris, over to you. Is that fine? 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, that'll work. So thank you very much. And I think this will follow nicely on Ty's comments. I'm going to try to see if I can share screen here. Looks like we can. Can you all see that okay? Yep. Okay, great. So my comments are going to build a lot on what Ty has already laid out. I think he did a really nice job framing the nature of the two systems and the strengths and weaknesses and kind of how they stack up against each other. And then what's different about the nature of this particular competition. This presentation is going to focus deliberately from the Chinese perspective. So I'm not going to do a comparative one. I'm going to try to give you a sense for how China sees some of these dynamics that that Professor Ming Cheung has just laid out for us. So I think it'll complement nicely. So this is the argument right up front. I think whenever you have an audience on Zoom, it's good to just tell them what you want to say and then get out of the way and let the conversation go and become a little bit more dynamic if we're able to. So the thesis that I'm going to suggest is that China's perspective on this competition is really the present instantiation of a long-running strategic link between technology, specifically innovation, and broader modernization of the Chinese civilization. And this is an effort that goes back to the end of the Qing dynasty, I'm going to suggest, and continues fairly unbroken right up till today. So I'll kind of walk you through some of that historical context and that logic, which I thought might be helpful for this audience in particular, because I find that in a lot of my conversations, we're still woefully ignorant about a lot of this Chinese history. And it's important to understand from a strategic perspective, because it's important to understand how China's coming at some of these problems. And I think that's going to be a useful contribution. So 3 points I wanted to kind of use to drive home. First, this is embedded in this very long run historical narrative that the party has really honed into this notion of rejuvenating China today and restoring China to its proper place among the community of international nations. This is part of a long-running modernization of the Chinese civilization. So it's important to understand that China thinks of itself as a civilizational state, and then this modern Westphalian nation-state concept is a modern instantiation of a much larger, longer civilizational sense of place and of themselves. And then thirdly, a lot of what China does in this realm is motivated by this fear of being left behind. So a lot of the competition has this dynamic to it that feels like if we don't do this, there's a very real chance that history is going to repeat itself and China will be left in the dust once again from a technical perspective, from a technological perspective. So I think all three of these things come together to kind of form an anchor point around modernizing China, which has often historically been the fuel behind modernization efforts and reform efforts more broadly in China. I think it's important to understand how these things are connected together in a political sense domestically in China. And you can think about it very simply on this pendulum of reform or be more conservative and sort of hold true to the more traditionalist notions of what China ought to do. So we'll start way back at the Century of Humiliation, the Opium Wars. We're not going to get into a ton of detail here, but I encourage people to to read deeply on this area if you're interested in understanding more about how China sees the nature of this competition. But there's a pretty clear watershed for the Chinese civilization at the end of the Qing dynasty, when Western imperial powers come in and basically dismember the Qing, the weak Qing dynasty towards the end, and then later it's going to lead to revolution. And this is really brought home with the Sino-Japanese War, the defeat of China in 1895, that ostensibly upsets the relatively sort of Confucianistic sense of order and the proper arrangement of superiority. And so China, in a very self-centered, egoistic perspective, thinks that it should be the civilization on top. And this upstart of a post-Meiji restoration Japan has now upset that order and defeated China, and now says, well, now Japan is on top and China's below Japan. And that really shakes China's sense of itself and its perspective. And a lot of this then kicks off a very deep reflection about why, how could this have happened? What drove this? And the answer for a lot of those debates internally to China is it has something to do with technology, particularly the ability for a country modernizing, like China was, like Japan, post-Meiji Restoration Japan, was able to adopt and include and incorporate a lot of these technological advances in a way that China was not. And that accounts for the difference here. And so when you see a deliberate move to rejuvenate China and create the new China at the turn of the century, there's going to be the strong emphasis on modernization, and particularly a technological dimension to that modernization. And so I get into a little bit of detail here. We could get into more in the Q&A depending on what people's appetite is for the history. But this goes back to, again, the Opium Wars, the Tongzhi reforms, and then the self-strengthening movement. And I think of these as increasingly more radical swings of a pendulum along that spectrum between reform versus traditionalism. And as the end of the Qing dynasty is sort of spiraling out of control, you're going to see this pendulum swinging more and more and more radically as the revolution is going to come in 1911. That's going to bring to an end the whole dynastic cycle in China, or at least ostensibly that's the mission, that's the objective. So there's these increasingly radical swings. The 100 Days Reform makes things politically possible for reformists in China that previously were unthinkable. The idea of doing away with the examination system in China, the very core essence of the governance structure, of the professional bureaucracy, of the education system. A lot of these very radical ideas now have the fertile ground politically in the space to kind of take root. And then the pendulum is going to swing back again with the Boxer Rebellion, when they're going to say, no, this is too radical. We want to be able to be more traditional, more conservative. And so you see this big swing in these increasingly radical vacillations politically for China. And into this, you're going to introduce these radical ideas of radical thinkers, people like Liang Qichao, who has this vision for really strengthening and rejuvenating the Chinese people, a renewal of the Chinese people. It's couched in these very civilizational terms, but he is in Japan. He's exiled, not exiled, but sort of, he's an intellectual exile, I guess, like a lot of these thinkers are around the turn of the century. And he sees what Japan has done and says, China needs to do something really radical like this. We need to completely revolutionize our civilization. It's very revolutionary thinking. And Sun Yat-sen is going to build on some of that and have this nationalist vision for how to make China strong again. So that eventually is going to, I'm glossing over a lot of history here, but it's important to understand the context in which this stuff is taking place. The KMT period, Japanese occupation in World War II, all of these lessons are going to be lessons that for China are going to be hard-learned lessons that reinforce this idea that technological superiority is the difference maker. It's the reason why you lose in a war. It's the reason why you're conquered. It's the reason why you're occupied. It's the reason why the KMT is going to be seeking to do some of the things that it's seeking to do during its period of the nationalist warlords. It also, so then the communists are going to be victorious in 49 in the Civil War. During the initial experiences of the early PRC, the Korean War drives home again the importance of superior technology, jet power, artillery, the idea of nuclear weapons. It's going to launch the space age, the Sputnik moment, the nuclear age. All of these things are going to be the formative crucible of the early PRC when they think about technology. The Sino-Soviet split then is going to rob the PRC of a major source of a lot of this technological innovation. And that point that Ty made at the very end of his presentation about contemporary Russian-Chinese cooperation on these technical side, I think you're going to see a hearkening back to this moment of heyday of Soviet Chinese cooperation. And there'll be a desire to kind of return to that. We're in the same boat together, united against the imperialist West, that these guys are out to get us, and that we're going to be in a position to be able to cooperate together and defend what's right, not from a communist perspective now, but from a sovereignty perspective or authoritarian regimes perspective. So then the Sino-Soviet split, when that ends, China no longer has access to this technology, it kicks off the 4 modernizations. This is going to become the centerpiece, again, politically, domestically in China, creates the space for Deng to really carve out his doctrine and his strategy, which is going to be predicated on opening up a reform, which is going to launch China on this modernization effort that will result in the China that we see today. This starts in '78. This is China's grand strategy as a rising power, to create the conditions internationally that allows China to grow and be able to proceed economically and become a great power. And this strategy holds, I think, until the financial crisis in 2008. Today, I would suggest that there's a pretty consistent line in China that connects this perspective on the current contemporary geo-economic competition back to this long-running modernization effort. So a lot of how China sees this competition is embedded in that longer trajectory from a strategic perspective. And it's also in this new great power grand strategy. So this is China's new strategy that I'll suggest China has adopted since the financial crisis. There was a period of sort of figuring things out in the early 2010s, but I think it's pretty well set now. And the strategy essentially says China is now a great power, and the world needs to learn to live with it. The world needs to learn how to accommodate China's preferences, and China has some preferences. They're largely, from China's perspective, modest in terms of what they want to see happen, but they are going to begin to increasingly feel free to exert these preferences. And that's going to play out into what they do on the geo-economic front. So I think one interesting example here is their response to the trade war from 2017. There's 3 things that they tried to do, and they continue to try to do all 3 of these. First one, negotiate directly with the United States, find some modus vivendi, some way to accommodate and to be able to coexist with the United States, even if that means an increasingly decoupled situation. The second one, which I think is particularly germane to today's conversation, is the United States offers an almost irreplaceable demand signal to Chinese exports. And that complementarity is really important to understand, even though it's intermediated by a lot of Southeast Asian and regional value chains. Ultimately, the demand signal is from US consumption. And that's what drives a lot of Chinese exports. And they need to find a replacement for that. And if you look at the size of economies around the world, the only logical place they could find those kinds of developed OECD levels of consumption are Europe and Japan. And so cultivating actively those alternative consumer markets is a really important part of the strategy in the event that the United States market can no longer be reliably counted upon as part of the export-driven growth model. And then the third one is to make lemonade on the lemons that they've been given and begin to accelerate the conversion of the domestic economy away from an export-oriented growth model towards more of a domestic consumer model, domestic consumption model. And this ties into concepts of dual circulation. They'll try to do all 3. I know I'm running short on time. These are a couple of the recent developments. Happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. Ty laid out a number of them as well that are out there. These are some specifically technologically oriented dimensions of the Chinese strategy. And I think that it should be clear from my perspective, there's a very clear strategy involved here. The idea that China is somehow fumbling along and making it up as it goes is true for any nation's implementation of grand strategy, but that doesn't mean that there's no vision behind it and there's no intent behind it. There's, in my reading of the evidence, it seems pretty clear to me that there's a clear vision and a clear effort to implement a strategy here. China tries to build multilateral regional institutions. We can get into that in more detail if people are interested in it. I also think that the standard setting is another important area of future competition, and China is keenly driven towards establishing standards in ways that are going to provide favorable conditions, or what China thinks are favorable conditions to its ability to compete in the long run. And this often means in emerging technologies where these standards are less well established. And it often is going to be driven by a coordinated government effort, which is very different than Ty's example in the United States, where we prefer to have standards emerge almost organically. There's a certain coordination that has to happen, But we much prefer to have winners and losers chosen by market dynamics as much as possible, rather than being directed from above. All right, and then I provide a little bit of a strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis of the Chinese system. I am happy to get into that detail and more in the Q&A if we've got time. So that's it. These are the trends I see happening. These are the future areas where I think there's going to be likely to have direct conflict. And thank you to the organizers for today's panel. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Norris. It's a sort of stunning review of history of Chinese perspectives on the techno developmentalism, perhaps. We now realize how deeply that is historically rooted. And also thanks for situating US-China trade war, as well as Made in China 2025 in that sort of context. Now, let's move on to the presentation by Professor Vinod Aggarwal, as well as Dr. Andrew Reddie, introducing the US approaches on the new economic statecraft. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Buongiorno a tutti. I'm very pleased to be here. I wish I was in Italy, where I grew up in Rome. Anyways, moving on to determinants of economic statecraft, slide 1, next. The US has gone through an evolution in its thinking, and I think we had some very nice discussions of the evolution of thinking with respect to China, and Time and Cheung talking about the difference between the United States and China. So we're going to focus mainly on the United States. So I think in the United States, we've seen this period of no statecraft, not really understanding the link between economics and security. And this can be best exemplified by Bill Clinton, It's the Economy Stupid, in 1992, 30 years ago, and focusing on only economic issues. So, but as we know, the global economy is not just trade deficits, supply chains, unemployment, and growth rates, but this excessive focus just on the economy, I think, led the United States wrong. Now, what do we see then? We see another approach to looking at economic statecraft, which is actually quite old, which is that you look at national security completely separately from economic issues. There's little integration of economics. You focus on analyzing patterns of conflict and cooperation and power balances, which we see in traditional examples of research in this field. Now, we also had some excellent work by David Baldwin, which was a exemplar of interesting work looking at links between security and economics, and his book is called Economic Statecraft. But his primary focus was on sanctions. And of course, these days, that's getting back to be a hot topic with Ukraine. So we can think about sanctions as an important example in looking at Iraq and sanctioning Iran and the like more recently. But in fact, there's much more to its economic statecraft than just looking at sanctions. So if we look at our approach, what we try to do is we take this economic aspects of security competition, driving state intervention in a very important way. So our focus is in some sense looking at international political economy the way we've been doing it for many years. I as an international political economist and Andrew more on the security side, but we're also trying to understand intervention in the domestic market. And I think Ty laid it out very nicely when he said, Chinese have a kind of a top-down approach. The United States has a bottom-up approach, but and he did say, well, there's not always the case, and I think that's true. In some sectors of the economy, the United States is developing somewhat of a top-down approach, and that's something we're going to look at. So if we think about when do you intervene in the market, how do you respond to protectionism? I think this is a very good example, which is I would consider a somewhat absurd example. Maybe in the current Ukraine Russia conflict, it may not be all that absurd, but this is the textile industry lobbying the 1950s saying we need 150 million to 200 million woolen blankets to survive a nuclear war. So when people lobby, their industries lobby for protectionism, they always focus on whatever their industry might provide for security, including this idea that you can protect against radiation. Please don't try this at home, it really won't work. So I don't think this is actually going to be a very successful approach, but it shows that industries are very good at lobbying all the time and claiming they're important for national security. So if we look at the theoretical debate, we see two kinds of arguments. We see a neoliberal argument that all of you are familiar with: efficiency, transaction costs. And when I teach in the business school, this really appeals to them. Just look for your supply chain at the most efficient countries. Don't worry about politics, push on. By contrast, neo-mercantilists focus on security of supply. And with the recent crisis, and I don't mean just the Ukraine crisis, I mean the COVID crisis, we've seen that what constitutes national security has not gone to the extreme of woolen blankets, but it has gone to thinking about things like personal protective equipment and the like. Next. So if there's two periods, as I mentioned, this neoliberal economists focus on global economic production, and then don't really focus much on things that are important to the supply chain and making security of supply. And there are these two, what one might say, diametrically opposing positions. I just want efficiency, or let's just focus on security of supply. Now, where does the truth lie? Well, as always in political science, it's a continuum, right? We know that there's some security of supply and efficiency. If you only focus on security of supply, you're going to end up with a Soviet-style economy, inward-looking. If you only focus on efficiency, your economy will be very efficient, but you may not be thinking enough about security and the linkages between the two. So how should we study these issues? Basically, what we do is we look at industrial policy, we look at American industrial policy as well, and we look at how states are trying to leverage also global governance mechanisms, that was pointed out by Will very nicely, the global system, to leverage their own interests. So we're really interested in how strategic industrial policy is being developed, not just industrial policy in general, as the Biden administration is doing, but really focusing on very strategic industries. So what is our approach? We look at the implications of the global economy for what we've, lots of people have called geopolitics. We look at three things: trade, investment, and industrial policies, as how countries manipulate these three for economic statecraft, how they try to develop economic statecraft. And then we try to determine under what conditions we will really see economic statecraft in the sense of both behind the border, at the border, and beyond the border, to investigate the importance of these technologies, innovation networks, and human capital. Next. So now I'll turn it over to Andrew, who's done a wonderful job of moving slides.
Thanks, Vinny. Appreciate it. Yeah, so as Vinny pointed out, I mean, really what we're doing, right, is unpacking the state, if you will. So, oftentimes in this literature, it'll be, China does X or the United States does Y. And in reality, there's political pressures that underpin what country policies end up looking like. And so what we're trying to do in our work is really to try to unpack and find those political pressures, if you will, across different levels of analysis to do things like predict what a country's industrial policy or types of state intervention might actually look like at the border, behind the border, vis-a-vis trade policy and investment policy. And of course, it is the corrective to the economic statecraft literature that looks externally at sanctions, but also here looking internally at what states do, with a little bit of the hunch that in reality, laissez-faire is never really permeated as much as we think it has theoretically, and that, the autarkic kind of push of state policy is pretty significant and needs to be understood. And so we kind of suggest that there's kind of 5 macro level drivers of the types of state intervention that you're likely to see. So on the left here, you've got the domestic political drivers that are driven by domestic structure of the state. So this is where bureaucratic politics and state-firm relations live. Even in contexts like China, where you have top-down economic policy making, you still have the firm level firms that have significant power, if you will, and we can have an argument about how much that power waxes and wanes across different administrations inside of China, but all to say that those firm level actors are incredibly important, whether you're looking at Alibaba, Tencent, and what have you. You also have market characteristics associated with any particular technological development. So Vinny and I have done a lot of work on the cybersecurity market, increasingly doing some work on the market around artificial intelligence goods. And the market characteristics associated with those particular technologies is really important. So, how many firms are inside of that marketplace? Is security of supply something that's essential for the government to achieve, right? Is it an excludable good? Are there high or low barriers to entry? Can states achieve economies of scale within that particular marketplace? And then you've got the technological characteristics associated with any particular technology. And here, what you've seen from Thai is actually really illustrative. So some technologies are purely civilian, and it's very, clear. You can see it on the tin. This is going to be a civilian technology. Others, military technology, right? If it explodes, likely it's a military technology. But you have those technologies that are dual purpose or dual use that are a little bit more difficult to categorize. And that's where some of the enabling technologies that you might be interested in today, from quantum technologies, quantum sensing, quantum computing, vis-a-vis encryption, or artificial intelligence technologies really kind of matter. They have military applications alongside their civilian applications. And while we want all of the civilian goods from them, you also don't want to necessarily have all the kind of military bads, if you will. You also might be worried about different technologies being more or less appropriable across state borders. And I'll talk about that more here in a second when I talk about the interaction between China and some venture capital investments here in the United States. And then finally, you've got the international level drivers. So that goes from anything from system level characteristics, vis-a-vis polarity and kind of the background of competition between states, and then global regimes and how they might mediate the ways in which states intervene, whether that's the World Trade Organization or the variety of minilateral frameworks that are increasingly being created across various regions across the globe. And Will shows you some of those examples from RCEP, SCO, et cetera. And all of these 5 characteristics, in our view, kind of drive the different types of state intervention that you're likely to see. And so it is important to remember that this isn't just a US-China story for us. This is trying to kind of understand the phenomenon of state intervention writ large, of which the United States and China kind of represent case studies. And so kind of to that end, you've already heard, the kind of stereotypical story around China being kind of top down, where you have significant amount of government intervention inside the marketplace, particularly, from the centralized government, but also at the provincial level, which, obviously we shouldn't forget about. And increasingly you have China's outward focus, where, they're engaging in emerging markets, particularly in their region, following the release of the Made in 2025 policy. And you can see orders of magnitude increased investment externally. And some of that has to do with, growing their, regional alliances and relationships with their near and also far neighbors in places like Africa. But it also has to do with technology transfer. And so one of the things that some recent American legislation has tried to deal with is some of the requirements for technology transfer associated with companies being given access to either Chinese investment or the Chinese market. And so you saw on Will's slide some of the concerns around IP theft, but also, sometimes the tech transfer is actually far more cooperative than that, at least from the perspective of firms, right? In order to get market access, firms are willing to sign over some amount of their IP and share that with their Chinese counterparties. And then, of course, that intellectual property is subsequently filtered through various SOEs inside of China itself. Of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The United States, among other Western countries, has attempted to respond. So you see a variety of cases in the WTO. You saw the trade war that's been referenced by both Thai and Will, particularly Section 301, which actually does hark back to Thai's example of the US-Japan relationship in the 1980s. And then we have the firmer legislation, which seeks to limit the amount of Chinese investment inside of the United States and increase the amount of controls that CFIUS has to actually look at those investments and potentially block them. And of course, this relationship, remains complicated today under the Biden administration. Various efforts by Blinken, who you see there, to kind of reset the relationship have proved, not necessarily fruitful. With regards to FIRMA legislation, a variety of Western countries have very similar requirements, and an increasing number are passing them. And effectively what's happening here is that foreign direct investment from China is being scrutinized in order to try to arrest some of that IP transfer that we're worried about, particularly around technologies that are quote unquote strategic and have those kind of dual use applications. And of course, as Vinny pointed out, the COVID-19 pandemic context has made this much more significant as states have reassessed what constitutes something that they need to have security of supply over. So there's various efforts across Europe and the United States to reshore what are core capabilities. And so in the United States, the easiest example that I would point to would be around semiconductor and microchips, and trying to make sure that that supply is secured from any disruption amidst a broader issues that we're having in global trade at the moment. This is an area of the field that, in our view, is ripe for further research. And Ty is doing a lot of work to support this research across the globe now, which is fantastic. I think that there's good theoretical work to be done around, what constitutes dual use technology, whether there's ways in which scholars can kind of better delineate when technologies are primarily military, primarily civilian, or kind of fit inside of this box, and what happens when they actually are dual use and enabling technologies for defense. I think that we're certainly interested in the United States and China, but we're also interested in how other states attempt to try to drive technological development inside of their country as well. And then, obviously East Asia and Europe loom large here as well. We've done a lot of writing in this space, as you can imagine, and look forward to the discussion here moving forward. So I'll end it there. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Aggarwal and Dr. Reddie. Now, sorry to make you hurry, but we are a little bit behind. So I would propose to the audience to enlist the questions and comments from now on. And by the time when Dr. Govella finishes her comments, we collect everything and then put back to the speakers. So please, Dr. Govella, floor is yours.
So much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. So my comments will be based primarily on the presentations that we saw, although one presenter was kind enough to send his slides in advance, for which I thank him. But it's really striking, even looking at the themes of this panel and of this conference, the complexities of the things that we're talking about. And I think you can see this most concretely in the sheer number of words included in the titles of everything. So we have geopolitics, geo-economics, security, regular politics, regular economics, innovation, technological revolutions, great power, rivalry, and all kinds of things. And, it's striking that in the last few years in particular, it has become very common to talk about these things together. And, the false dichotomies that we used to see perhaps more often between economics and security are really not an issue. Really now the question is how to understand the ways that these things intersect with one another. And for policymakers to understand how to structure their efforts to deal with these challenges. So just as there is stovepiping and separation on the academic side, also on the policy side, trying to overcome those artificial barriers, bridge expertise across fields, and to create a toolkit if you're a policymaker to deal with these things. So it was really striking as we went through the presentations. They were excellently sequenced, how we had different levels of analysis. We started with the system level from Time and Cheung with a comparison of essentially national systems as the unit of analysis, then moving to the historical narrative story from William Norris. And then we had our unit of analysis as one state at particular snapshots of time, particularly crucial moments. And then with the paper by Vinny Aggarwal and Andrew Reddie, they really did bring firms much more strongly into the picture and then bring in the tremendous richness of sectoral comparison. So between the three papers, we really did cover a tremendous universe of substance. I thought it was interesting that, all of the presentations necessarily had to focus on something because there was a lot of complexity, but they focused much more on promotion policy and less, though we heard some in the last presentation, on the increasing moves to regulate the problems that have been associated with these problems through things like investment screening mechanisms, different kinds of measures to protect critical and emerging technologies. We heard a little bit about that with tech transfer in Andrew and Vinny's presentation. But of course, governments are very actively now trying to intervene in the processes that you're describing to come up with new methods, which firms have varying feelings about depending on where they are located in supply chains and what their business models are. But, we have very controversial things like outbound screening investment being discussed. We have an anti-coercion mechanism in the EU, for example. So we have really, in addition to all of the complexity that our presenters have discussed, a tremendous amount of new or at least revised mechanisms from the past that are reasserting themselves, which will complicate the picture even further. So a couple of general comments, and then I'll just offer a few thoughts on each paper. But I think that one thing that is striking as well, besides the emphasis on promotion, of course, was the emphasis on competition, which makes sense given the theme of the panel. But, a question for all of the panelists is, do you think that these problems or these dynamics that you describe can catalyze cooperation in ways as well as competition? So for example, in some of the presentations, it was mentioned that a lot of the security concerns that have emanated from trade relationships with China have resulted in other conversations about cooperation with trusted partners or friend shoring and ally shoring. Of course, these things also have competitive aspects between the firms, which I think complicate them. But, in some ways, are the competitive trends that you see perhaps also mirrored or paralleled by some moves towards cooperation? I think in Will's presentation, he may have mentioned that China too is trying to find other sources of cooperation in the face of its increasing tensions with the U.S. and its traditional, home for exports. So will that also drive Chinese efforts towards cooperation? Will they find, willing partners for that? And overall, of course, we focused, on great powers in this panel. So where does this leave the other states not mentioned by the presenters? And how much does their role matter? Of course, we have a very complex global economy now. And the comment I just made about cooperation is touching on this. But, when we think about the various economies of Europe, we think about Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, other parts of the world, do their decisions and their narratives, or perhaps their interpretations of the narratives that you've talked about, matter in this kind of global competition? And if so, how does that play into these more nationally focused models that we were talking about? So those are some thoughts to start overall. In terms of moving through the panel papers, I thought that Tim and Cheung's useful contrast between systems was really a great way to get the conversation started and to characterize this simplicity, particularly the discussions of the differences in rivalry during the Cold War to the present are sometimes lost in contemporary discussions. But although I do think that awareness has increased over the years, I would maybe just pose a question to the author about, do you think that some of the complexity in sectors or differences, does that make a difference to your system level analysis? Do you think that, for instance, we could see, as some policymakers sometimes suggest, a separation of systems where certain critical industries are really, characterized by this kind of strong competition and more by the models that you see, but that, there is a more free-flowing, engagement in trade in non-critical sectors that looks a little bit more cooperative or not as starkly defined? This is actually a matter of ongoing debate. I feel like every panel I attend in DC has somebody asking this question about selective decoupling, essentially, and is it possible to still have cooperative relations while having these systems that are engaged basically in massive competition on the systemic level? So perhaps just a question to the first author presenter. On the second paper about historical narratives, there was a tremendous amount of richness through Chinese history there. I think there's a lot of questions that come up here about sort of real narratives and narratives that, are made up for countries for domestic audiences, or narratives that are made up for perhaps international audiences, and how these things differ and how much they matter. I think that something that came out in particularly the third presentation was that, at least in the US, we're in a time when the US narrative about its own models is changing rapidly and policy thinking is shifting. So, what does it mean when these different national narratives are interacting for William? And, what does it mean perhaps when some states are radically changing the way that they're thinking about things? And, how can they think about it? So for example, in terms of China, the presentation very clearly laid out how Chinese thinking is interwoven with this aspect of technology at the core, and technology as the center of development and security, essentially. So I think the presentation gave us a very good sense of how this might affect Chinese actions, but does that have an impact perhaps on how other countries think about interacting with China as a player on the international stage? It seems like that narrative is going to become increasingly at odds with some of the other policies or things that states are trying to do to basically counteract the successfulness of Chinese technological promotion and pursuit in some ways. So how can we think about these narratives in interaction beyond the Chinese case is basically the question. For the final paper, I appreciated very much how it brought the firm and the sector back in and really complexified the picture quite a bit, while also on the flip side demonstrating, how that complexity can be very difficult to deal with, and how, all of the different components that were displayed within one national system, kind of have different configurations or balances in each country that we look at. So certainly the complexity does not make the analyst's job easier at all. So I think questions for the final paper and presentation. So firms are obviously at the center of a lot of these policies. As much as we focus on, governments and what they are doing, at the end of the day, firms need to be involved, at least to comply, if not to also be active crafters and pursuers of the same goals. So, I think that when we look at the actual effectiveness of some of the policies that governments have put forward at this point, and for example, in trying to persuade companies in moving out of China, or trying to persuade them to, restructure their supply chains, I think we're, at least in the few years that we have so far, seeing rather limited effects. So, I would be curious about how you see that interaction playing out, and to what extent, some of these conversations about state actions may be focusing a lot on one part of the picture without seeing, the full impact and actually the effect on the global political economy. I'd also ask, how do you see the different industries? So I, mentioned this earlier, but you mentioned the importance of defining dual use, and, the tremendous efforts that are going now into understanding different industries. But do you think it is possible, for example, to, take strong actions in some of these more critical sectors that have more explicit military applications, or really, are we in a world where everything has become so securitized that it really, I think an example in a policy panel I was at recently was something like, toys and clothes and things, even things like that are just, need to be considered in their context of promoting national prosperity and promoting, industry health or things like this. So, as you look at the firm or sectoral picture, what do you think this definition of dual use gets us in terms of understanding the differentiation between sectors, and how much it may be possible to buffer some areas of the economy from the securitization or tension, or if that's even perhaps desirable from your point of view. So I'll just stop there. Great presentations, and I hope that I have offered some thoughts to kick off the discussion along with questions from the audience, hopefully.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Govella, for the rich comments on, this all three presentations, as well as for the individual presentation. Now, we have one question from Mr. Dr. E1 about the nature of the state-owned enterprises in China. How much, to what extent does it hurt its ability to innovate technologically? So combined with this question, in order of presentation, can I ask Professor Tai-Min Cheung to respond, in 3 minutes each, and then in order of presentation, I just give you the floor. So please, Professor Cheung, can you start, please?
Cool. Okay. I'll respond first to the questions put by Ms. Govella, which was excellent. The first was about sort of like the issue about competition versus cooperation, sort of like more broadly, and that's a great question. And in many ways, it's like, I mean, what we see is that while the US and China, there is this growing competition, and that becoming increasingly intense. I mean, it's what China and its allies, and the US and its allies, they are focusing on increasing cooperation. And in many ways, that's going to be as critical as the competition between the US and China, because the US, especially under the Biden administration, it's made it clear that it can't compete against China on its own. It has to bring its allies, whether it's on the Five Eyes or whether it's on the Quad or whether it's on these new mini-laterals, the AUKUS, etc. How do they sort of like find ways to cooperate, etc. And on the Chinese side, the Chinese are looking to have the same sort of approach. It's like finding ways to bring in sort of like like-minded countries. And so in many ways, it's like you have sort of at the systems level, these growing sort of like sort of bipolar competition, but within these spheres, there's hopefully increasing competition, etc. And it's like so it's going to be pretty messy. So it's not what we're seeing. It's like competition everywhere. It's competition at the grand strategic level, but sort of below that, it's like especially amongst the allies, there's going to be very sort of like novel ways. And what we're seeing is increasingly sort of like sort of innovative approaches so like to this type of cooperation. But then it all depends on which areas, how strategic, how dual use, etc. And so there's like so there's a lot of sort of like sort of potential for new models of cooperation. On your question for my particular sort of point about sort of like the different sort of like at the sectoral level, is there sort of like different types of competition or cooperation? I mean, my areas of primarily sort of like in terms of the techno-security system is focused primarily on strategic and military areas, sort of like in the non-strategic, non-military areas, there's a lot of cooperation. And in many ways, it's like, I mean, so I have a book coming out on this whole issue, especially on the Chinese techno-security state. And sort of one of the sort of like findings in my book is that the techno-security system, as part of China's overall economy, constituted less than 10% of its economic prosperity, right? Or 10% of its GDP. So the techno-security sort of like competition is actually a small part of the overall sort of Chinese system. And likewise, I think for the US, the vast majority of the economic activities are in sort of like areas where there's potential, sort of where there's a lot of trade and investment going place. The problem is, and as you've mentioned, this growing securitization, that is like what it used to be just clearly national security, increasingly is that definition of security is spilling over into many areas, as you said, toys or anything. It's like so the problem is that the areas where it's like sort of like increasingly security, dual use, etc., that's expanding. I don't see it expanding to become the majority, but it's like but that's where the momentum is. Okay, and I'll leave it there first.
Great. William,
Sure.
could you
3 minutes.
Yeah.
So first on cooperation as opposed to competition, I think it's certainly China's preferred approach. I think they would rather not have anybody competing anywhere and just have everybody cooperating, because they see that as being a space that they're very comfortable gaming to China's own maximal interests. I think that if you want to be a little bit more objective about it, though, cooperation, I agree with Ty, it's likely to come where there's already pre-existing strategic alignments. And I'll elaborate that in just a second. So in my work, I find that economic cooperation, of which I think of the technological and geo-economics and this topic that we're focused on today as being a subset of broader economic cooperation, that generally only happens when you have a larger strategic environment of strategic trust and alignment of preferences. And under those conditions, you get actual beneficial, genuine economic engagement and what we think of as non-zero sum economic behavior, of positive sum economic cooperation. So I think that's my take on cooperation. It's going to happen when you have that strategic trust and alignment among parties. That could be in reaction, like you get with Russia and China feeling like, well, the world's out to get authoritarian regimes. We have a lot of common ground, so we should cooperate together. But I think it's always going to be a little bit of distrust there. And I've got other stuff that I've done that talks about that, the context of that relationship and that bilateral relationship. The second question that Ms. Govella raised was other states and where do they left in this overall cooperative or conflictual or competitive environment. The first response here is that it gives them agency. I think that allies enjoy a lot more agency under these kinds of conditions because they are desired partners for both sides, both the United States and China, which I think smart allies are, like South Korea has done this for a long time. They feel like they're the shrimp among whales. They always have to think about how they play different sides off each other. I think in general, allies enjoy more agency under these kinds of conditions. That said, I agree that my first point, in terms of the strategic alignment and strategic values and trust, what a lot of these other countries are very quickly finding is that there's a lot of common ground, not necessarily with China, but maybe with the United States in this bilateral competition environment. And so there is that strategic alignment. And then the question is, how do we work out the details of cooperating under those frameworks? And there, I think there's a lot of room for creativity, as Ty had suggested. I think there's going to be a lot of beneficial new ways and creative ways that we'll be able to design that'll propel us forward in the 21st century. So I really think that this doesn't have to be a negative experience for the other states. I think this could really be beneficial to the other states and to the United States, I would argue, because I think it's one of the strengths of the United States is that relationship that we have, because our fundamental interests largely coincide with and align with the fundamental interests of European partners and allies, with Japanese partners and allies. I think there's so much common ground that we share as democracies and as those kinds of nations in the international system, that there's a lot of room for cooperation there. So from China's perspective, which is what I'm supposed to be portraying for this part of the panel, there's three things I wanted to comment about. The first one is China's likely to play and to move on the seams, areas where it finds that it has more agreement and more values than it sees present in the US partners and allies network of relationships. So for instance, there's been a lot of friction around data privacy issues between the European partners and allies in the United States because of our commercial players. If China sees that as being a source of friction, that's a space they're likely to come in and say, hey, we think that there ought to be these kinds of assignments, these kinds of standards. We have a lot of common ground with the Europeans. So it's one area that I would predict is an area that China's likely to try to play into and to say, we need to have these kinds of safeguards. These kinds of information need to be properly safeguarded. We need to have sovereignty that's going to be able to be exercised over the internet. It can't just be allowed to run rampant. So they're going to find ways to kind of identify those areas of potential agreement and values. And that's where China's going to prefer to try to play. The second part from China's perspective is going to be in the absence of existing governance structures. So emerging technology, new areas that haven't yet been institutionalized, that's going to be a space that I think China's going to find a lot of room for potential cooperation where China could lead. And it sees its ability to help define those new institutions, and that's going to play to their interests. The third area is in areas where the United States and frankly the rest of the world views, where China and the rest of the world views the United States as having dropped the ball. Places where US leadership is insufficient, or it's seen as having overstepped its boundaries, overplaying its card as the dominant hegemon of the international system. Areas where China's going to identify and say, yeah, don't you kind of wish we could do things differently? Well, we have an alternative for you. Those are going to be the places where China will try to seek out and forge that cooperation, where the United States is seen as having failed in a lot of international ways. Her question about narratives, I'm not, although I come across today as a constructivist and as a historian, I am neither of those. But I will say that these kinds of narratives are very powerful for the folks that espouse them. And when they come in contact with each other, there's necessarily a constructed dialogue that's having an impact. There's necessarily an exchange of ideas. And so those sides of me are kind of constructivist. So I think that there is this Sinocentric narrative, which is a very centered around China perspective, I think is fairly self-serving and fairly transparent to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world looks at it and says, well, why are we benefiting from this? And this is, in my opinion, one of the US's greatest strategic strengths, is we could be completely transparent and say, this is why we're advocating for this perspective, because it is in Americans' best interests to have that be the case. And by the way, run your own calculations on that, and you probably find it's also in the other players' best interests to share the same kinds of properties of these institutions, of this international system. And I think when China does that, they're finding, well, goodness, when you run those calculations in our preferred vision, yes, China comes out looking good, but it's less clear how other countries benefit from that Sinocentric perspective and paradigm of that narrative. And I think that's something that they need to work on. It's something that you're probably going to go back to the drawing board on and try to figure out how what's good for China is also going to be good for the rest of the world. But right now, I don't think they're quite there yet. Those are my comments. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Norris. Who is going to take the floor? Professor Aggarwal first?
Yes, I'll just say a few
and-
things, and that I'll just say a
second,
few things, and then we'll turn it over to Andrew. So basically, what I'd like to say is I thought Dr. Govella did a fantastic job of bringing together three different papers on a whole host of topics and actually being able to talk about some very complex things in a very different way and showing there's an integrated whole to this. So I just want to talk about one thing and to turn it over to Andrew, that's middle powers. And Kristi herself has done a lot of interesting work on middle powers. And I think because of the nature of the panel, we didn't end up talking about middle powers, but of course they're a central player. Unless we understand what the South Koreans are doing, what the Taiwanese doing, the Singaporeans, etc., and European countries who all have various strategies, we really will not understand supply chains very well. We'll not understand trade patterns very well. We'll not understand financial issues. So in fact, in our own work at the center and in cooperation with IGCC as well, we've held several conferences on middle power strategies in a world of superpower competition. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Andrew to go into some details about Dr. Govella's other questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Vinny. Yeah, on the question around catalyzing cooperation, it reminds me a lot of the Mearsheimer-Eikenberry most recent debate in foreign affairs among many, right, vis-a-vis engagement and containment. I think as a scholar of arms control, I'll just point out that even in the most significant confrontations between superpowers we've had, there has been cooperation. They have come to agreements that there are international frameworks that are to their mutual benefits, right? And that's where things like the various, arms control agreements come from, whether it's START and then ultimately New START. Around the kind of the theoretical framework, I mean, that's what Vinny and I are wrestling with, right? The parsimony or the kitchen sinkness, right, of the framework itself. The way that we're attacking it is by looking at emerging technologies as units of analysis. I think the best case for a technology set that, is non-securitized, at least right now, would be the green tech side of things. But, again, we could have an argument about the secondary or tertiary benefits that you get from actually developing that technology in terms of it, permeating across the economy. And so, that's fair enough. So that's how we're kind of attacking that parsimony kitchen sinkness problem, if you will. With regards to Dr. Wang's question, I think that, increasingly that narrative around China's, focused on SOEs leading to a lack of native innovation or indigenous innovation is changing. So, if we'd asked that question about 10 years ago, we would have said, yeah, China's behind and is likely to stay behind as long as it has this economic model. I think that stance has softened somewhat recently. Although if you're looking at something like semiconductors as your proxy measure, China is state of the art, something like 20 nanometer chips, whereas Taiwan's is more like 3 to 4 nanometers. And so, we can kind of talk about the various, benefits and the way in which SOE-ness drives that. But I think that the way that I often think about it is that in a lot of ways, China's innovation network is challenged by its insularity. CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, has some fantastic work that demonstrates the degree to which countries that are on the frontier of tech development really rely on cross-border trust and networks for innovation to occur. So, for example, some of the most advanced switches for supercomputing technologies come from Holland. And so if you don't have that tight integration between, the firms in Europe to the firms in the United States, the firms in Taiwan, right, you don't get to be at that frontier. And so, that's how I would tend to think about it. But I think that the simple narrative of China being behind and staying behind is changing somewhat. Although that's my read. I'd be interested if Ty, Will, and Vinny agree with me.
Oh, thank you very much for this, time-saving comments. But I'd like to ask Dr. Govella to respond, picking up some of the most important themes as you regard. But at the same time, we have two questions. One question about the state-owned enterprises. I would like to ask Professor Ming Cheung to respond. And Andrew, Dr. Reddie, could you take up the Mariano's question on the cyber warfare, because you must be most qualified. So please, Dr. Govella first, if you have anything to add or respond or whatever, 2-3 minutes, is it fine?
I will just say briefly that, again, I enjoyed the tremendous richness of all of the papers. And I think the panelists have already demonstrated that, there's much more complexity than they even mentioned in their papers to start. So I will cede my remaining 2 minutes to the audience questions and to the presenters to deal with them. But again, it was a pleasure to listen to the presentations.
One of the questions that you raised about the, how about the other states, rather than the United States and China. In the next session, we will deal with the Japanese perspectives as well as European. So those who are interested in this kind of question, please take the next session too. So from Professor Ming Cheung and Dr. Reddie, could you respond, please?
Okay, thank you very much. Andrew's had a stab at Mr. Wang's question. It's so my take is, China has different technological innovation models. So there's not just one sort of monopoly model. The role that the state-owned enterprises plays is primarily at some of the strategic areas, some of the areas that the Chinese state regards as the most important. So like emerging technologies like AI, quantum, and and all those, as well as on the strategic and the defense side. And the Chinese model for technology development in these strategic areas is where the state-owned enterprises plays the central role. And so the Chinese have it as as Will Norris mentioned, they call it this this 2 bombs, 1 satellite, Liandang Yi Xing model, where it's a selective authoritarian mobilization model of technology development. And so they play critical areas. But there's also in some of these more commercial, these non-strategic, more civilian-focused areas of technology development, especially in commercial goods, in that civilian marketplace. The private sector, the non-state-owned enterprises, they've played a very, very important role too. So there's this balance between state-owned enterprises and the non-state-owned enterprises. The issue now, though, as we've seen, especially last summer, is that the Chinese authorities are worried that the private sector, and especially some of these these major tech firms, the Alibabas, and those, they become very, very big. And so there's this effort to try to tame that. And so what you get is that there's this growing efforts at state intervention by the Chinese authorities. and that sort of state intervention increasingly is protecting the state-owned enterprises and going after the large non-state-owned enterprises who increasingly appear to be sort of like challenging so the authority. And so there's this constant sort of churn in the last couple of years. And this is sort of very, very important because especially since last year with the 14th five-year plan and a new 15-year science and technology development plan, the Xi Jinping regime is sort of defining what China's long-term development sort of technology development model is. And it's this move away from catching up, sort of like, which has been the dominant model for the last sort of 30, 40 years, to focusing increasingly upon sort of becoming a original innovation sort of state, getting to the frontier, to the global frontier. And the question is, who does the state wants to be in charge of sort of like leading that charge to the global frontier? Is it state-owned enterprises? Is it the private sector? Or is it finding that balance itself? And I would say, so up until the last year or two, the Chinese authorities were trying to find a balance between sort of between the state sector and the private sector. They had these terms like the whole of nation, so like innovation model, where they had both private and state players. But in the last year itself, what we're seeing, this crackdown on private companies, private tech companies, and emphasizing more important role for state-owned enterprises suggests to me that the more state-focused model is the one that's driving sort of like the charge going forwards.
Great, Andrew, please.
Yeah, Mariana's question is a good one. And I think if you'd asked it in December of 2021, I'd probably give a different answer. You know, all great powers, right? Russia, China, United States rely on information technology in order for their militaries to function. So, you know, they're mutually vulnerable to cyber attacks. I think there's kind of two different scenarios that we worry about in terms of cyber attacks in a state-to-state context. One is below the threshold or gray zone, where, you know, a lot of China's cyber attacks have tended to live, and then the use of cyber alongside other military operations. And indeed, it's not likely that in a significant state-to-state back and forth that you're going to just have cyber attacks, right? You're going to have conventional as well, and cyber is going to be there lurking in the background. In terms of cyber driving escalation, it's a fear, but I don't think it's you know, a terribly significant one on the back of what we've seen in Ukraine. I think that overall, we found that kind of conventional capabilities are really kind of the coin of the realm in terms of the actual military engagement there, rather than being kind of at the technological frontier using cyber or space assets, which is not to say that cyber attacks aren't happening in that context, only that they're happening alongside more conventional capabilities and back and forth. And thus, I think it's probably fair to say that the state of the art in the field suggests that maybe some of the fears around cyber are a little bit exaggerated compared to the reality that we're most likely to face.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. You know, we unfortunately run out of the time, but this panel was about the sort of nature of the great power competitions, where the power and interests intersect, security and technologies overlap, and where the US and China clash. And if we look into, we see how complex it is if we look into the histories, sectors, actors, values, and open up to the black box to see the determinants. It's so complex. But unfortunately, that is a sort of the state of affairs where we are in now. I would like to conclude the session by thanking all of the wonderful panelists for the excellent inputs. And we and myself are inclusive, learned a great deal. So I would like to congratulate all of the panelists. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And the those who want to continue to look at the European and Japanese perspectives as well as their aspects of energy crisis in the shadow of the Russo-Ukrainian war, just please stay on. All of these panelists are going, and then new panelists are coming in. So thank you very much indeed. Again, thank you and goodbye.